In 2004, the industry leaders Exxon, BP, Shell and Total chalk up profits of 51 billion euros. And the future for the oil sector is rosy, according to Gene van Dijk. This independent oil entrepreneur has spent 50 years in a business that, as he says, has brought him a lot of enjoyment and many millions of dollars.
The day of low-price oil is gone.
Forever.
Forever. As I mentioned, it is the first time that the demand for oil has ever exceeded the supply, and the demand is going up a lot faster than new oil is being found. And so the price of oil is not going to go down. And we just, you know, the world has to live with it. They do have a lot of cash flow. But the problem with at least the large companies, they have a lot more cash flow than they have places to drill.
The Gulf of Mexico, off the coast of Texas, just a few kilometers away from Houston, is one of the places people are pinning a lot of hopes on. Van Dijk thinks that offshore, under the sea, is the only area that still holds promise of success in the search for new, large-scale oil deposits.
We're here at about, we're about 10 to 12 miles offshore now, off the coast by Galveston, Texas. This is really where the offshore oil business really began, all along the Texas-Louisiana Gulf Coast. And we're only in about 100 feet of water here or so. And the oil industry really, in the last 50 years, has been going in progressively deeper water. Now they're drilling in depths of 8, even 10,000 feet of water. 3,000 meters is common because they simply have tapped all the oil that is available here close to shore.
The amount of oil coming from the Gulf of Mexico covers only a fraction of demand. More than half the oil needed by the USA now comes from other countries.
Domestic production is falling and consumption is rising. So what this has meant is what we're seeing now in Iraq, which is, in short, that America's foreign policy and America's energy policy have merged so that they can't be separated. America is in the Persian Gulf because it doesn't have an energy policy, and we're in the Persian Gulf because we can't stay away. This is the future of America's foreign policy, America's military policy for the next 2 decades. Right now in the U.S. there are about 200 million vehicles on the road. So even if George W. Bush woke up tomorrow and had some, conversion, some radical idea that he is going to change the way America deals with transportation, bringing on new hybrids or more efficient cars won't have a dramatic effect until virtually all of those cars are replaced. And that's a multi-trillion-dollar cost that will take decades.
But so far, no radical changes are in sight. The challenge of growing demand is met by increasing imports.
It may be 10 years down the line, 15 years down the line, maybe it's 25. But a paradigm shift of this magnitude, shifting away from the West's reliance on oil as its energy source for transportation and as an industrial input, is a colossal task. And no, I don't see anyone really coming up with well-thought-out means of addressing the intellectual and economic capital that will be required to address this issue.
One of the leading experts and author of the standard work on black gold is Daniel Yergin. Oil, he believes, is first and foremost an intrinsic element of national power, the ownership of which gives rise to conflicts and wars.
The answer is to diversify the sources of production so that there will be crises, there will be problems. We've seen it over the last few years, how problems in Nigeria or in Russia or in Venezuela can affect the world oil market. And the answer, the only answer that we've really found to deal with that political risk, and that's whether you're a company or whether you're the world community, is through diversified resources. Don't be too dependent on one part of the world.
We need to recognize that the primary resources of this world lie outside of the United States and even North America. That many of these countries that we will rely on our energy needs are in very politically, economically, and socially risky areas. looking at Africa, Middle East.
60% of the world's oil reserves lie in the Middle East. The second biggest portion of that in Iraq. Among the first objectives for American forces in the last Gulf War were Iraq's oil fields. But the calculation that access could be secured didn't work out.
I think one of the bitter ironies about George W. Bush's decision to invade Iraq, despite the many thousands of deaths and so on, is that it really hasn't given the U.S. any more control over that oil, but it has increased the U.S. military presence in the Persian Gulf, and now the U.S. has no choice but to stay in the Persian Gulf for the foreseeable future.
Even with the war over, hardly a week goes by in Iraq without attacks on drilling installations and pipelines. U.S. military presence can't prevent them. A situation which is not without repercussions. The Gulf War has left the oil market more nervous and the price more volatile than before, and has pushed up America's oil consumption.
I just found numbers from the Pentagon that indicate that they're now consuming, the 140,000 troops in Iraq are consuming about 1.9 million gallons of fuel per day, and all of it has to be imported into Iraq. And so, you know, from a strategic standpoint for the U.S. military, it's a terrible situation.
Houston is dependent on the drug oil. Without it, the refineries on the outskirts of the city would close down, in the second largest petrochemical complex in the world. The question of Washington's strategies for securing adequate oil imports in the future is nowhere of more interest than here.
And we have to talk about Vice President Dick Cheney, because in this area I think it's Dick Cheney who's the principal strategist in the administration. And I think he understands very well that increased U.S. dependence on imported oil will put the United States at greater risk, both of terrorism or involvement in local conflicts, and therefore we have to have a bigger, more powerful capacity for what they call power projection, for intervention in the developing world. And this has been the hallmark of the Bush-Cheney military policy from the very beginning.
Dick Cheney became U.S. Vice President straight from the executive floor of the world's biggest service provider for oil companies and the armed forces, Halliburton. In his new office, he presented George W. Bush with a paper laying down the guidelines for America's energy policy in the decades ahead.
They project a 50% increase in U.S. oil consumption over the next 25 years. And that really is a very tough requirement to fill. It will mean a substantial increase in U.S. imports of oil from foreign countries. So procuring all of this additional imported oil is one of the primary concerns of the Bush-Cheney Energy Report. In fact, 1/3, 35 out of 105 recommendations in the Cheney Report are specifically about increasing America's access to imported petroleum.
The key message. The report recommends that the President make energy security a priority of our trade and foreign policy.
The Bush administration does not have a strategy other than invade the oil-producing countries and militarize the oil-producing regions and the oil choke points. That has been the thrust of all of Bush's policy so far. And you see it now in the Strait of Hormuz. You see it in the Strait of Malacca. You see it in Panama, in the Suez. The U.S. now is the military's sole goal around the world has become to militarize the choke points and to militarize the oil-producing countries that are friendly to the U.S. And I think that that trend is clearly going to continue.
The report also sets its sights on a new oil region. Along with Latin America, West Africa is expected to be one of the fastest growing sources of oil and gas for the American market.